think this comes back to, if you're in that zone, you can be distracted about the November changes, but relative to the actual opportunity sitting in the business right now, the November change may actually be relatively small compared to the bigger opportunities within your existing business. And so I think my advice is I'd be getting to work on what is the opportunity in my business right now, and how do I prioritize which opportunities amongst all those opportunities that are likely in my business. How do I start to prioritize and choose and get to work on those opportunities so I can actually build the practice that serves me, not the government.
Yeah, and I think don't see this as an easy exit from facing those problems, right? So patient deaths, frustrations around, like you said, compliance with the billing rules. The worst thing that people could do is, rather than fix those problems, jump into a different frying pan in a different fire and then try and solve the problems in there. I think you're right. It's about saying, okay, what are the opportunities? What are the issues I'm trying to solve? And get to it now. Don't wait till November. That would be unwise.
Hey, welcome to today's Scale My Clinic podcast with Sachin and Todd. Today, we're talking about the November bulk billing changes and the 12.5% incentives. And Todd is going to tell us what we should do. So Todd, tell me, the incentives are coming. What should I do? Where do I sign? Give me your money. Tell me.
All right, Sachin, this would be the first time you'd listen to me, so I appreciate you asking me for an opinion. It's really interesting, right? So I just want to be clear, there's probably three groups that people fall into when we're talking about the bulk billing incentive and more broadly the package that's been presented for November 2025, which is bipartisan now. And so there's probably people that are a green light that will definitely accept it. And those clinics are ones that are already bulk billing now. And so they're used to the workload, they're optimized their systems for providing this care. And so they're obviously going to take it up unless they're planning on shifting to mixed or to private billing, but that's probably unlikely in this environment in the next 6 months or so. And then the group at the other end, the ones that would never consider it, are those that run mostly private billing practices, have really good cohorts of patients. The clinics are medium to larger size, and they're not really considering it. The ones that are in between, the orange light, where they might only privately bill, say, 20 to 25% of their patient base. They have a high number of people with healthcare cards, with seniors cards, all of the other cards that go with concession-based fees. And so they already bulk bill a large portion of their patient population. And it's kind of having trouble with collecting the money or getting people over the line with paying. Some of those might be thinking about shifting back to bulk billing because they came away from it recently. So let's talk to that group in the middle that are thinking about it. And as well as offering the bulk billing incentive to people without concession cards. And just on that level, well done to the Australian government on offering welfare to people who don't need it. I don't quite understand why you would do that in any system. I mean, it's just a way of buying votes, I guess. But usually the whole point of government is to make sure that services go to those people who can least afford them and have difficulty with accessibility. So this is one of those ones where it doesn't really make sense. But let's say you think, you know what, I'm going to do this. And then there's a small little caveat here. That is, the cheeky buggers haven't yet declared what they're doing with CDM to CCM change, chronic disease management to chronic condition management, as if that's a meaningful shift in wording. But anyway, this is what happens with the marketing bullshit that goes on. And because they haven't told us about it, guess what they're going to do, Sachin? They're going to screw you. That's what they're going to do. That's what government's...
Todd, there's two things now that I've just got to disagree with. Politicians buying votes and the government screwing general practice. What precedent is there to say such a thing?
Such a thing. I'm really ashamed of myself for thinking that politicians will promise the world and deliver an atlas at best. And so the reality is that's going to be a worse, in fact, it's probably going to be a bit of a shit sandwich. You'll have to supply your own source. And then the clever stuff here is they'll just defer that slightly. And so most likely what will happen is that you don't find out how bad that is until you've accepted this new agreement. And so in order to qualify for this 12.5% bonus, you have to sign up to a government website. You have to declare that you are going to bulk bill all services. So you're making a promise internally to your team, externally to your community, to your existing patient base. Now, again, like I said, if you're already doing that, no big deal. But if you're not doing that, you're basically saying we are no longer going to offer private billing in this environment. There's not really any clarity over what happens with treatment room fees and all of that stuff. So I think we just park that for now. This looks like it's mostly around attendance item numbers. Now, there's a few things that I think are important to understand. So far, what I've read says, well, you don't get paid this money straight away and you don't get it through PIP. You get it through some presently undisclosed mechanism related to My Medicare. So you're going to have to do a lot more work with My Medicare to make sure that your patients are enrolled. Although, again, that's not mandatory as part of this. And then you get the 12.5%. It sounds like around about a quarter in arrears. So you get a bunch of money that comes in later on. And apparently the money goes in two payments. One payment goes to the clinic, and one payment goes to the GPs. Again, the mechanism and the split for that hasn't yet been determined. And so there is conceivably an environment whereby an individual GP in a clinic could determine they're going to bulk bill in a clinic that isn't bulk billing. So even if the clinic isn't registered, the GP could be registered to do that and still receive that 12.5% bonus, and the clinic would miss out on that. And the clinic has a scenario where if one doctor breaks ranks for one transaction on one occasion ever, where a patient with a valid Medicare card gets privately billed for something in the attendance item numbers, then the whole deal is off. All 12.5% goes begging, and you won't get it for that quarter, and then you've got to have, again, another crack for another quarter. So what's the problem here? Well, I reckon there's a multitude of problems. The first is that you are buying into the government scheme. So you are basically agreeing that you have faith the next decade in general practice will be very different to the last decade in general practice. I don't know what nut job believes that the government will be any better in the next decade than the last. If you look at the funding at the moment and you look at the funding that goes to general practice, which has increased around about 2.9% per year on average over the last decade, that's pretty well at inflation, the funding. This is general practice more broadly, not just MBS for GP rebates, but all of primary care. And then when you look at the hospital system, which goes up at more than double that, and then you look at the NDIS, all these other drains on resources, there is no way that the feds are putting more money into this. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign up to this. You're going to get the 12.5% on a quarterly basis, but in very short time, it'll become a contract that you agree to in advance for 12 months or beyond, that you commit to meeting the requirements of this. This is very much NHS style. So you're going to have a contract to supply services. And then, Sachin, my favorite thing, I worked in the UK for a year and I saw some of this stuff, but the English love a friggin' charter. So a charter is where I'm the government and I get you to sign up to an agreement. And then I go to the patients after I've asked you to sign an agreement as the owner of the practice. Then I go to the patients and I say, hey, guess what? You can get same-day appointments from Sachin because here's a charter that just says you deserve same-day appointments. And here's a charter that says you can have as many visits as you like per year, but the cap on the visits will be the next thing. This is the amount of money that's being capped for this. And so you start ending up wedged between a rock and a hard place because you've signed an agreement for money. And then on the back end, there's variations to that agreement. You ever see a government agreement? It's got as many variation clauses in it as you like. You'd never commercially take it on unless you had an alternative. And so you end up stuck between unrealistic expectations sold to patients and you on the other side that has a real difficulty in supplying what has been promised by somebody else that has not only do they have no idea about what's being supplied, they don't actually give a stuff about it. So they're not really caring about the quality of the medicine that's being offered. They're just caring about the fact that it is free at the point of care. So that means that you as a doctor, if you're doing mixed billing at the moment, you are committing to seeing, this is only if you want to maintain your income, right? If you're happy to take less money for doing more, completely fine. But if you want to maintain your income, you're going to have to see 1 to 1.5 patients per hour more. So over a year, if you're doing 4 days a week, 32 hours a week of consulting, that's the equivalent of 1,500 to 1,800 more consultations per year. And the tail that goes with all that, following up the results, following up the referrals, worrying they get in the hospital, all the palaver that goes with seeing patients that is invisible to them, you're going to be doing a lot more of that. So basically 20% more of that is going to be normal, 20, 25%, maybe as high as 30% more work. So be working harder to maintain the same revenue. And then you are basically making a bet that the government is not going to screw you and they're going to continue to index this by inflation or above. I reckon if you spoke to hospital doctors about hitching their wagons to government promises, particularly in New South Wales, they might say, That's an unwise thing to be thinking, Todd. I reckon you need to check your optimism there. So I think that's the other problem, right? And once you've done this, so once you've said to the community, hey, we're bulk billing, and once you've said to your GPs, we're bulk billing, we're into this, we're all in, what do you reckon are the odds of you going back to not doing that at a later point in time?
Absolutely. I mean, all the paying patients will make their way somewhere else where they get something closer to what they want and expect and are happy to pay for. So then, reversing any change you've made, you're ending up trying to leaf through the haystack for the odd needle. I think as an NHS refugee, there's a couple of things that stand out from the NHS playbook. Both actually NHS playbook, and the other playbook is some of the private insurers playbook with dentistry. So I think, first of all, the goalposts undoubtedly will change. And so the 12.5 might change in terms of the amount. So the 12.5 might go up, but it might go down. The other thing that could well happen is that the rules and requirements, the threshold you need to meet to access the 12.5, that definitely over time will change. And so it might be a contract, like you're saying. It might be some other arbitrary agreement. It might be opening hours, forced opening hours per week. It might be a certain number of services must be provided. They've got open slather over what they can do to change it. And the likelihood is that many practices that change to this model, if they choose to, are going to be in a situation where the majority of their margin is made up by that 12.5. And therefore, that's essentially what they dangle in front of the GP. And the GP becomes effectively a dancing monkey, the practice, to do whatever the trainer, the government, tells them to do. And you've seen this play out in dentistry, where there's been some integration with private insurance, and then the practices that have jumped on to do that have then been squeezed in terms of all of those same things. And it was just a form of vertical integration and cost control by the insurer, not really about the highest quality output for the user. And so you've seen that happen. I think the other part that you mentioned, Todd, is the workload. If you look on the 27th of March, the government released a modelling document, the impact of bulk billing investments on GP earnings and billings. They obviously merged two methodologies when doing this. They used the performer method, which is pull some figures out of my arse, and they combined that with the GP registrar's earning calculator and came up with some nonsense where, in their world, a GP who consults for 3.8 hours twice a day, so two 3.8-hour sessions across 5 days a week, is the typical GP. And then they did their modeling based on that. What they did not at all include or understand, or seem to show any understanding of, is that I think by the last studies, more than 25%, around or just above 25% of a GP's workload is done without the patient in front of them. That's all the stuff you're talking about. And so with an increase of volume of consulting work comes a whole increase of volume of the non-consulting work. And in a world where it's free, then we all know large amounts of the non-consulting work, the paperwork, is actually non-Medicare rebatable. Then there's huge pressure on the individual GPs and the practice to manage a whole load of paperwork, potentially without being able to charge for it, because they've got patients who are trained that everything's free. And this, to me, is prime SD from the NHS, where you would come in on a typical day. I might have 50 to 100 pieces of paper, both physical and digital, that I would have to manage in addition to the patient load. And so I would be managing that at speed, and the risks just multiply. The workflows multiply. The amount of patient contacts multiply from that, all unpaid and all contributing to stress and potentially in the longer term burnout. And so I think it's really important to be super clear on who we are as individuals, as GPs, and as practice owners and practices, and what we want to stand for, and not think that we have to play the game that we're being set up to try and play. The other thing that I think is important, you just spoke about quality medicine. It might be worth, just in the context of this, I'll mention one thing. I think you'll have other things to say. In the documents that were released in that last week of March, there's been, for anyone that signs up to the 12.5% incentives, they've sidelined the need for accreditation for
which is
another change, which tells you something about quality of medicine and standards and where the focus is for government. What do you think in terms of the quality of general practice and what we know to be true based on the studies and evidence that's been done about general practice? How does that compare to what's being asked of general practice if a practice or a GP or a practice owner was thinking of implementing this? How do the two fit together? Because I think, yes, we're here to talk about business, but all of us are really passionate about high quality primary care. How do the two fit together or not?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So if we go back to first principles, in order to do high volume of anything, you must have low variability. You can't have a high volume and high variability pretty well in any scalable system. Medicine is complex. The people that think it is simple, generally the people that are top mount stupid on the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? Because they think they know it all. And so you see this in prescribing rights being handed out to other providers because they think that just because the end output of consultation is a prescription, then the whole consultation is about getting the prescription. Like there would be a really easy assumption to make. And you and I did some work on this, on the volume of work and experience required to achieve licensing in other professions that general practice. And it's nothing like it. Like we're talking 10 to 15% of the hours committed to learning. So doctors, and this is not to denigrate others, but doctors have a training that is second to none. Like they are bloody awesome. It is full-time training for 10 to 12 years to get to the standard that they're at. They are very good at taking an undifferentiated presentation, GPs in particular, and turning that into something you can work with and holding uncertainty in such a manner that it gives people a path forwards. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. That I said to you earlier, in order to do high volume, you've got to have low variability. Does that sound like low variability, like taking everything that comes in the door?
Semi-rhetorical question. I mean, so sitting in the consulting room, and then, well, I used to go and get the patient from the waiting room. You don't know what's coming in. Apart from those days where you fitted someone in and you've said, make sure you tell me why they're coming, and they've written it in the best practice appointment notes. But generally, 90%, you don't know what's coming in the door.
Right. And so the longer term average, and this has been stable for an incredibly long period of time, the average amount of time that GPs spend with patients is 19 minutes. And on average, we see patients 7 to 8 times per year. So that tells you that there's a combined commitment of 7 or 8 visits around about 20 minutes each time. If you're going to cover the same things in less time, there's only really 2 alternatives. One is you see people more often. So therefore, you've got access blocks because you're doing that same work in 8 visits. You're going to have to do it in 15 or 16 visits. That's the reality. Or the other alternative is that you truncate the appointment. So rather than spending 19 minutes, you spend 8 minutes. Because if you're going to see 5 patients an hour, the reality is you're going to have 10-minute appointments. And if you have 10-minute appointments, you cannot spend 10 minutes with any one patient because it takes time to call their name, get them into the room, open the file, have a read about them, finish up the consult, get them out, get them back to the front desk. So you're probably talking 7 to 8 minutes actual face-to-face in the red zone, as the Americans call it, right, in the actual consulting. So that says that you're either going to choose to go less deep on an issue. So you're in, Sachin, for your respiratory infection that you've got at the moment. And you mentioned that you're having a lot of trouble in life otherwise, and you're feeling a bit flat. And I would just say, that doesn't sound great. Let's make an appointment. There's no appointments for 2 weeks. I'll see you in 3 weeks' time, Sachin, and we'll make another 10-minute appointment. I can't commit to making a 20-minute appointment because if I do, then I'm screwing myself at your expense. And frankly, that's just not really fair. Like it shouldn't be that I have to be screwed so you get what you want. So you got another 10-minute appointment. That's it. And so you need to get your stuff into gear. So in that 10 minutes, we talk about that stuff. And if you forget about it or you bring something else up, bad luck, that becomes the priority. That's the only way this works. Because I'll be buggered if I'm spending 20 minutes with you. I've done the maths on it. You know what happens when you spend an hour doing, you can't do 3 level C's in an hour. You can only do 2.7. And so you're probably going to need to take 21 to 22 minutes with each of those consults. If that happens, you earn at least 12.5% less for the hour. So guess what? You're getting paid money now just to be level pegging with what you should have been doing on the 5 per hour. And you're waiting for that money from the government just to top you up to where you should be. That's not going to be a fair and reasonable trade-off. And I'm going to ask you, so I used to find this really curious, and running practices, my rule was really simple. I wouldn't want to own or run a practice that I wouldn't want to be a patient in. But I know a lot of doctors that would not choose to accept the care that they offer. Now, that really does my head in. If I'm a car salesperson, I'd only like to sell the cars that I would drive. I'm not interested in selling a car that I don't think is awesome. I need to believe that it's worth it. And again, I don't mean to denigrate ubiquitous bulk billing, because there is certainly a place for this. And where accessibility is impeded and the inverse care law takes place, then that's the only care people get. I do think we should address that in a different way to this. I think there should be the SEIFA. We should be able to balance areas of relative disadvantage with a bonus payment of some sort. So I think the way that we counter this is it should be ridiculously good for GPs to work in low socioeconomic areas. They should actually just find that's a no-brainer, and they should get paid as much or more than the doctor that's working in a really highly privileged area, and there should be no charge to the patient. So I think that is definitely part of what I think should be included in the offer that we make to universal healthcare. I do believe in universal healthcare, but I don't believe in the system that's been proposed as actually offering anything like that. In fact, what it mostly does is offer GPs the opportunity to take a hit so as that the community can get free access to something. And as you rightly said, this is as good as it's going to get. It's not going to get better than this. It's only going to get worse, because you're going to start getting other ingredients popped in as well as the bulk billing. Once that's done, then the next thing will be ours. It'll be availability. It'll be accessibility. All of the things you can see. If you've got a kid under this age, they can be seen within 4 hours, blah, blah, blah. Pretty well whatever the hospital system says they want and they need, you're going to have to meet requirements. So appropriate requirements for referrals to outpatients. You can imagine all of the wet dreams they have in the health department of making doctors do things, right? So everything's going to say GPs should. When you see that, you should get nervous. And then I'll start thinking about how they embed that in the claiming rules. And so the problem is that you have to trade off autonomy, and you have to trade off your expectations around doing a good job, because you are going to have to truncate your visits. You are going to have to not be comprehensive in a consult. You might be able to be comprehensive over a year, but you're talking about twice as many consults to do it. There's just less time to let things breathe, right? That's the reality of the type of medicine that we'll be offering, because like you said, Sachin, you're just going to have a large volume of unpaid work as well as a large volume of paid work. And you're probably going to get Sunday-itis. Sunday night, you're probably going to start feeling a little bit sick about Monday mornings, because there's a song about it. And you're just going to start feeling like, I don't want to get in there and see all the shit that's arrived over the weekend that I have to address and not be paid for. And the people it's not the fault of the patients who see you. They don't know that stuff's coming in, right? People think that just stuff auto-magically happens, and they do those broad gestures to your screen. It all happens in there, doctor. It's all in there. They just look, it'll all be in there. And it's not their fault. They don't really know how it works on the back end. But I think that that's, a genuine issue, that you're going to have a large volume of extra work. Taking holidays and coming back is not going to be pleasant. That's another area. And then, as you said, Sachin, there's going to be the odd hand grenade in all of that stuff that you're meant to be on top of. It's going to be, I remember seeing this stuff. You get letters from the outpatient department that was like 6 months old, sometimes even longer. It would say, oh, hey, this person's really depressed. We're worried about their suicidal ideation. Could you make it a priority to see them? It's a 6-month-old letter. You're like, what the hell? What am I supposed to do with this? But everybody loves to handball you responsibility. And that's a problem, right? We've talked about it before with endoscopists and whatever. Everybody gives you all of their crap that they should be following up. It's all your responsibility. You're going to make sure patients know about appointments. You're going to make sure they get there. You're going to make sure they go to their follow-ups. More goes on in general practice. It's just unfair and unreasonable. And you're not being paid for that stuff. And there's no mechanism in this to pay anybody for any of that work. They talk about multidisciplinary teams. You'll have responsibility to be accountable for other people's work. Guess what you'll get paid for doing that? Zero. Nothing. There's no budget. So they have all these ideas, these brain farts around, oh, yeah, GPs can manage more people doing other things. You're like, what time do you do that in? And how do you get paid for that? Oh, sorry, there's no budget for that. But the physio will be working under your clinic as well. You're like, well, that's great, but who's going to give them leadership? Who's going to hold them accountable? Who's going to manage them? None of those things are addressed. And I'm not sure what these people think general practice is like, but it's a real private business, has real overheads. So if you don't have a competitive, structural, sustainable advantage in low-cost overheads, you can't rent a building cheaper than anyone else. You can't pay less rates. You can't pay less on your utilities. You can't pay less on your insurances. You can't pay less on your taxes unless you're a not-for-profit. You can't pay less of any of those things. So you don't have a structural benefit in offering a low-cost service, which just means you accept doing more work for less money. And then, as you said, Sachin, you're outsourcing your profit margin to the government. And then imagine if one of the GPs in your team says, hey, Sachin, thinking about private billing one patient today. But you know what? I won't necessarily if you look after me. Like, how common do you think that conversation is going to be? Imagine if you are held hostage in your business by the people you serve. That's an unfortunately probable scenario, because you know why it will happen? Because it can happen. Because you can be held accountable for other people's actions. And by definition, you can't direct them to do what you want to do because they're independent GPs. That's going to be a really uncomfortable world for a lot of people to live in. And handing over autonomy to the government to say, hey, will you give me my profit? Because you're running a business at cost for them otherwise. And then you wait for the profit every 3 months. I'm not sure how fair or reasonable any of that is. And then, by the way, I bet you it comes at the same time that the BAS comes in and the payroll tax. So I'll give you some of it. They'll just put it in the left hand and then the right hand's already sticking out waiting for those taxes, right? Like, that's most likely how it will work.
Absolutely. So I think within all that, if we change the model, right? So yeah, we accept we're going to be 100% universal bulk billing and we decide to change our model. I think for me, the worst part in that is that as a practitioner, we tend to be quite deeply aligned to our identity of practicing. And so if there's someone listening to this who might be their standard consult ends up being on average 16, 17, 18, 19 minutes, they might start with the right intentions of, yeah, I'm going to change and I'm just going to do one problem. I'm only going to deal with that. But in reality, pretty soon they'll drift back to how they were always practicing because that's their sweet spot, their best way of practicing. However, now, rather than receiving what they're receiving currently, they'll be receiving the new amount. And because they probably won't hit that 20-minute threshold with the patient before they've even written their notes, the likelihood is they'll just be subsidizing the whole thing with a personal salary sacrifice and not a salary sacrifice in the right way. And so I think there's a lot of hidden dangers in this, but there's a lot of overt dangers. And so if someone was seriously considering it, I have some thoughts, but do you have any process by which you think that they should approach this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think this is the nature of type 1 and type 2 decisions. And type 1 decisions are the ones that can't be undone versus type 2 where they can be reversed. So the first thing I would say is this is the first offer. So what's good about this is the federal government has said we know general practice is not in trouble. So I want to be really clear. I think general practice, if we run a private business, like a lot of dentists do, where they don't align themselves with health funds, they just do great work and don't really care what the rebates are. Like, they're just completely distanced from that. If we run a business like that, then we don't have to worry too much about what happens around us, provided we're meeting the regulatory requirement. So I think that's part of it. The thing I would be thinking is, if I'm not sure what decision to make, the best decision is to delay the decision. I think that's probably the right call, because once you're in, you really can't reverse it. I know there would be a lot of patients who say, well, actually, I like the premium that's associated with seeing that doctor. I get to see the same doctor every time. I know that person knows me really well. They spend the right amount of time with me. I know their notes are great. They refer me to great specialists. You will be trading off that reputation if you say yes and you've been doing mixed billing. So I think I would recommend that those people defer a decision, that they say, we're not making a decision yet. We're going to hold out and we're going to continue to press on with private billing. And we're going to continue to run the best clinic that we think we know how, to the standards that we agree to. So there's a really good opportunity to be really clear over that. Use the next few months to build clarity, to make sure your prices are appropriate. They're a great value return and investment for those people. And it's a small amount of money. Like, even if somebody saw you for 7 level C private visits at a couple $100, then really over the year, they're talking about investing somewhere between $400 to $600 in total over the year, which is basically an hour of work for an accountant or a lawyer. That's the amount they'd be investing for that many visits over a year, even if they're all level C. So I think if we think about this, it's not a lot of money that you're asking for, and it's a great investment. If you want an important person in your life, I love my GP. I happily pay them privately. In fact, we had this conversation at the start. She said, we bulk bill other GPs. I said, like, hell you do. I'm not coming back unless you privately bill me. I can afford it. I come here because you're awesome, not because you're free. And so I would strongly encourage people, if they are mixed billing, to hold off and don't accept it, and to be really strong on your value proposition. You can change tack later on, but if you say yes straight away and then you decide to change tack, good luck. You've basically said that you're going to become a cheap provider of services and do high volume medicine. And then you're going to go back and say, actually, no, we've decided we're going to do private services and revert to quality. I would think most people aren't going to believe that. And guess where those people will be? They'll be down the road at the place that was like you at the start, but decided to stay out of it and privately bill and say, you know what, we're only doing 25, 30% now. Let's get to 50, 60, 80%, like the people that use our KT system in Project X have done. And so that is really what I would be advising.
Cool. I think for me, the bit I would say is, just to add to that, I think there is no rush here. I think that's number one. Number two, there's a contrarian approach. And so maybe, just like Todd mentioned, you currently in that zone where you're maybe technically you should be privately billing 70%, but maybe because of behaviors that have happened or legacy patients or for whatever reason, you're only actually bulk billing 20%. But you know that there's a gap of 40 or 50% of patients that they should have been bulk billed, but for whatever reason, we don't need to, dog didn't eat the homework. It's not that type of time. We don't need to reason as to why, but for some reason, the people that should be being privately billed, it's not happening. So if that's the type of practice that you currently have, you're doing great work, you're offering high quality services, but for some reason, people are falling through the billing cracks. What that tells me, if I was a practice in that zone, which is the oranges or the yellows that we were addressing from the beginning today, Todd, we know that there are huge opportunities in those businesses. And just one simple thing is, Todd just talked about the KT system. One of our members, they owned a practice, sort of 10 GPs. They'd originally bought it when it was 1, then grew it to 10. They also had this beautiful sign in their practice saying how much they charge. But when they looked at their figures, they found that they were only actually private billing 20% of all their consultations. And there was a whole group of people being unintendedly bulk billed, just for no good reason, just being bulk billed. And so the impact for that owner was that they're in a situation where they weren't profitable or marginally profitable, despite having 10 times the number of GPs as when they bought. They hadn't seen a commensurate increase in their financial return. So they did a couple of things, but the main thing they did is they engaged using something we call the first class formula in Project X, which is an engagement formula of our people. They actually had some really tough conversations with their people to understand what were the barriers. And what we realized is, in this situation, a lot of the patients had been trained to be bulk billed, and the doctors were struggling to have the conversation that they wanted to charge them. And so once they knew that, they built a system, the KT system, to lead the people who weren't intended to be bulk billed through a process to graduate them into paying fully. Now, that sounds complex and people might get scared of the thought of that. But what happened, Todd, was over the first 5 months, that increased from 20% to 66% privately billed. By 9 months, it was on a daily basis fluctuating between 85 and 93% privately billed. Completely changed the game for that owner and for the GPs in that practice. And so I think the message is, if you're in, and that's just one little but big thing, but we know with that owner, there's another 10 or 20 improvements that can have similar impacts in their business. I think this comes back to, if you're in that zone, you can be distracted about the November changes, but relative to the actual opportunities sitting in the business right now, the November change may actually be relatively small compared to the bigger opportunities within your existing business. And so I think my advice is, I'd be getting to work on what is the opportunity in my business right now, and how do I prioritize which opportunities amongst all those opportunities that are likely in my business? How do I start to prioritize and choose and get to work on those opportunities so I can actually build the practice that serves me, not the government?
Yeah, and I think don't see this as an easy exit from facing those problems, right? So patient deaths, frustrations around, like you said, compliance with the billing rules. The worst thing that people could do is, rather than fix those problems, jump into a different frying pan in a different fire and then try and solve the problems in there. I think you're right. It's about saying, okay, what are the opportunities? What are the issues I'm trying to solve? And get to it now. Don't wait till November. that would be unwise to do.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, it's been awesome sharing your views on that, Todd. Any final comments before we close up?
I think the main thing is, just like the Trojans, beware of government sparing gifts. I know the saying is Greeks sparing gifts, but I like Greeks and I like gifts from Greeks. So just be aware that this probably is a Trojan horse. You have not had one bit of evidence in the last decade to suggest that the Feds will be any more general practice than in the next decade. And so past behavior usually dictates future behavior. Think carefully about that before you make a decision, and that you hand reliance of your business sustainability over to someone else.
He's been Todd. I've been Sachin. We've been the Scale Clinic podcast. Bye-bye.